Let's go back to Stapplet.com now and look at the graphs. The first graph that popped up on mine was a segmented bar, but we can choose some other things. There's also one called a mosaic plot and a side-by-side bar. So I'm going to look at side-by-side bar. We can also see that side-by-side bar has relative frequency or frequency. So right now we're going to look at a comparison between the side-by-side bar relative frequency and the segmented bar graph. So you see so take a look, notice that on the bottom we have the travel class, first, second, and third. We have a legend up here that tells the darker color as they died, or the lived, and the lighter blue as they died, which just shows up as gray and light gray and dark gray on your sheet. Over here is the percentage or the relative frequency, so the percent in each category, and you can hover over those and actually see the exact amount if you hover over those with your cursor. So it's really helpful. If we go to the segmented bar graph, you can see that those bars now, instead of being next to each other, are just stacked on top of each other, and the two together always add up to 100%. So you can see that 38.4% lived, 61.6% died. And you can see that in each of the categories. So those are just two different ways to display two-way data in a bar graph. So let's just add a couple of things to your notes. So this, of course, is the key, and you always want to have the key or the legend. You want to make sure that that is written. Make sure we have nice labels on each axis. Okay, notice here we have the relative frequency, which is percent. The only thing that's really missing from this graph is a title. If we just looked at this graph, we wouldn't know what it was about. We would have the variable, one of the variables, but we'd have the variables listed, but we need to say what this graph is about. So I would title this Survival Status of Titanic Passengers and Staff by class. So when you see that, that gives you information, and a really good graph would say maybe at the bottom in small print how the data was collected and so forth. Notice that this is a distribution of data also. These graphs are also distributions of data because they tell us two things. They tell us the values of the variable, okay, which are first, second, third class, and staff, and for the other variable, lived, died. Okay, so they tell us the values of the variables and the percent of the data for each value. Okay. So we can look and see that you can see the percent who lived and died in each of these. Now, does it tell you the percent of the data, that's in the different classes? No, it doesn't. It just tells us the percent of the values who lived and died. Okay, so this is specifically focusing on the response variable, the percent of data for each value of the response variable. We actually don't know from this graph what percent of the passengers were actually in first, second, and third class. Okay, so we just know which percent lived and died in each class. So this is a distribution showing the distribution of the response variable. Now this one is called a segmented bar graph, and it tells us the same information just displayed in a different way. And notice that all the bars have the same height. They're all 100%. but the segments are different. So if we were to kind of analyze, this was like 39%, and this was like 61%, and this would be the 39 and the 61. So it just shows us in two different ways. Now, I want to define a very, very important term, and that's association between two variables. And we say that two categorical variables are associated if the conditional distributions are different from each other or from the marginal distribution. Now, we can see clearly that that is the case. The conditional distributions for each variable are different. Now, we see that the conditional distributions for third class and staff are actually very similar to each other, but they are different from the distributions for second class and first class. If we go back and looked at the table, we could also see that the conditional distributions were different from the marginal distributions. This does not tell us anything about the marginal distribution. So if we were to ask the question, is there an association between travel class and survival status on the Titanic, which was our research question? Okay, that's our research question. Our answer would be, well, I better write the question first. So, is there an association between travel class and survival status? And clearly the answer is yes, but that is not a sufficient answer for an AP Stat student. You need to say yes, and you need to support your answer and give some specific statistical information from a graph or a table to do that supporting. So I'm going to say yes. There is an association between travel class and survival status. I'm going to put on the Titanic because that's really what we're talking about here, on the Titanic. So what's the overall answer? I noticed the higher the class, the more likely you are to survive. The higher the class, the more likely a passenger was to survive. And that's a good answer, that's a strong answer, but that's still not sufficient because I haven't given specific proof for my last statement. I need to support that with the data. So I'm going to look at my graph and say, look at this. Almost 40% of my first class passengers survived compared to about 30% for second class and only about 20% for third class and staff. So almost 40% of the first class passengers survived compared to only 30% for second class and about 20% for third class and staff. So this is a complete answer when you're asked to explain whether or not there is an association between two categorical variables. Answer the question in context. Then support your answer with specific statistics from the graph or the table. This little paragraph here is probably the most important thing you're going to be learning in the first part of this unit, because you should be able to read a graph, and of course that's important. Can you actually read and interpret a graph? But if you can't say it in a clear way, make a clear conclusion, then you're missing kind of the point of understanding the statistics.